Oh, how he's eating lunch.
Hey, Michael. Little post-lunch snack, Michael.
Are you drinking whiskey?
That's straight bourbon. Michael said it was the only way I was allowed to show up on the call. Hey, Lauren.
Hey, Howie, you're much more entertaining that way.
I've been told.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, iPhone.
Hello, iPhone.
It's Cynthia. I'm driving, so I can't really be on, can't have my video going.
How long is this? I'm probably going to give this a few minutes just so people can sign on.
Afternoon, Michael.
Hey, how are you, Jeff?
Hey, how you doing?
I am good. Jeff, were you getting tired of showing your guest bedroom?
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Too many questions, right?
And yeah, and I've got to use this because my computer's in this room, so I can't use my iPad because I have another area that'd be better, but it doesn't work.
We usually give it about 5 minutes.
That's fine.
Anyone have any questions while we're waiting? Any pending legal problems?
I have a question. Michael, are you really a lawyer or do you just tell people that?
I just tell people that.
That's what I thought.
I dare you to ask Jeff that.
I might not be the smartest guy in the room, but I'm smart enough.
Good. How you doing, Howie?
Hi, Jeff. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good, thanks.
Hi, Josh. How you doing?
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Good, good.
Thanks for being here.
Always a pleasure.
Jeff, do you have the ability to share your screen? I think you do, right?
Hope so. I would like to share it. You want me to try now and see if it works? Let me do that.
Alfredo, you on? Oh, there it is.
Can you see it now?
Yep.
Cool.
Hey, Michael, can I make a couple of quick announcements and I'll let you and Jeff sort of
Yeah, no,
go from there.
absolutely.
So we're gonna do an all office sort of mastermind on the 15th. I think it's Tuesday the 15th. Hopefully I got my dates right. And it's gonna be around, you know, transitioning back to quote unquote normalcy and normalcy, or however you pronounce that, in many different respects. So I think it's gonna be really, and we're gonna have the ALC be leading it, and they're gonna be here in person. And we're probably gonna, you know, invite at least like a first come, first serve up to a certain amount of people. So again, part of that, you know, in consistency with the topic of the meeting is also just getting people back in the office. It's already become a lot more active. So stay tuned for that on the 15th, but we're real excited about that. And we're going to talk about many different implications as to what's going on in our business and things that we should be doing to sort of reorient ourselves toward the current environment, which is getting, which is great, and obviously loosening up a lot. And the other piece is In the office, everyone's welcome. The office is open. And we're doing it really on a trust basis. But, if you're vaccinated, you don't need to wear a mask in the office. So I know a few people have asked me that. I'm not wearing one, but I'm also respectful of people that are more sensitive to it and just trying to be mindful of, asking them, telling them, hey, if you're more than welcome to take your mask off, or if you prefer to leave it on, you're also more than welcome to do that. So good stuff. And I also just want to commend, as always, ALC for their commitment. We meet on a weekly basis, and they're behind the scenes and sometimes not so behind the scenes. And that certainly includes Michael, extremely committed and highly influential in shaping our office and the value that the office creates. So they're a great piece of leverage for me and people who I obviously think the world of. All right.
Thank you, Josh. So everyone should know Jeff, or if you don't, Jeff is with Spile Law. He is part of our legal team, risk management. So whenever you guys have legal questions that I can't answer, I forward you off to Jeff. And he's going to discuss a few things. You can see what's going on the left of your screen, and I'll let Jeff basically take it away.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Josh. Good afternoon, everybody. What we're going to cover in the next 7 or 8 hours, because Josh and Michael said I only had 8 hours today. So what we're going to cover between now and 8 o'clock tonight, no, actually it'd be an hour. I'm going to go over the new forms release for June for CAR, and I'm also going to go over the previous forms release for the COVID stuff, which just came out last week. And if we have time, I'll cover a couple other things as well. Michael or Josh, whoever's looking at the chat, my suggestion is I'm going to go through these like form by form, and I'll pause after each form to see if anybody has a question that they put in the chat, and then I'll answer it, because it's a lot easier to answer the questions, as we're going from form to form rather than waiting till the end. So more than happy to answer the questions, and I'll try to pause in between each form to see if there's any questions. So on the left side of the screen.
Sorry, let me just make a comment. If somebody does have a question, don't private message me or direct message. Put it in the chat so everyone can see it, just because it'll be easier that way.
And Alex, can you keep your eye on the chat box, and I'll let you sort of help monitor that, please? Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so on the left side, you'll see the June 2021 forms release. And if you go to car.org and you click on the top link there, which I think says transaction, it'll take you to standard forms. And if you go to standard forms, you will find this form. And you'll see it's like there's several pages here. And the top page just says, this page says what forms are being revised or what are new. And then it goes into a nice little description right here, a quick summary of the various new forms and revised forms. And it tells you what they're all about. So afterwards, I would recommend that you might want to go to car.org to standard forms, and you can get all this information. And that's basically what I'm going to be covering today, although I'm not going to cover every single revised form. So if you look at the left side of the screen where it says conditional June 2021, does everybody see where that is? Those 5 forms, a couple of which are revisions and one of which is actually a new form, that last one, the buyer broker compensation disclosure. Those forms were designed based on you probably are aware of the recent settlement between the DOJ and NAR with regard to the fact that real estate agents are going to have to disclose to the buyers what their commission is, what the buyer's agent's commission is. And unfortunately, while they have entered into a settlement, the DOJ hasn't put out any details with regard to that yet. So we don't know what the forms are going to need to say. So when you're looking at those conditional June 2021 releases, it probably is not going to happen in June, because the DOJ is just kind of dragging their feet on this. I guess they've got more important things to do. And so when the time comes, all the buyer representation agreements will have to be changed to include something in there which indicates to the buyer what the commission is to the buyer's agent. And then the last form there, well, not the last one, but the second to last, where it says anticipated broker compensation disclosure and buyer broker compensation disclosure. there is, and I'm gonna scroll down, there's a new form, I think it's down here, here it is. This is a form that may be used, but we don't know yet because we don't know what the DOJ is going to require. So this form, which is actually kind of obnoxious if you ask me, but this form is a form where you could actually disclose to the buyer what the commission is on all the properties that you're showing the buyer. But we really don't know whether that's what the DOJ is going to require. They may just require that you disclose to the buyer what the commission is on the property that you're actually selling, not on every single property you're showing to them. So this form is designed as a possible usage if you have to disclose every property, but we really don't know that yet. So I'm only bringing this to your attention so it doesn't blindside you when this hits. But my guess is it's probably not going to hit in June because, like I said, the DOJ really hasn't come up with enough details for CAR to come out with the forms. So with that, I'm going to go to the actual new forms that are coming out or already have come out.
Sorry, Jeff, can you just give like a quick minute just summary of what the lawsuit was with the Department of Justice?
Well, the DOJ had a lawsuit against the NAR claiming, amongst other things, that it was a violation of the law to not disclose to a buyer what the buyer's agent is making on the sale of a property. Right now, obviously the seller knows because the seller signs a listing agreement, but the buyer doesn't know what the buyer's agent is getting paid, what his own agent is getting paid. There's nowhere in any of the documents where it says, okay, I'm your agent, I get paid 3% or 2.5% or whatever. If you do a buyer broker agreement, there is language in there that says that the buyer agrees to pay you X amount if the seller doesn't pay it. But still, those forms would have to be updated to actually spell out what the seller is paying so the buyer would know up front what they have to pay. So there were a couple other elements to the lawsuit which involve not being able to search MLSs by selling broker or buyer's broker commission. There's another element that has to do with lock boxes where you're going to have to make lock boxes available to everyone who has a license, not just people who are members of your MLS. You don't need to worry about that right now. That's really more of an MLS problem. But basically, the main crux of the whole thing was disclosure to buyers of what the buyer's agent is making. And therefore, CAR had to come up with a bunch of new forms, which are in limbo right now, based on the details. Does that answer it?
Perfect.
Okay, so moving along to the first form that's coming out in June, it's the transfer of listing agreement on your right. So the transfer of listing agreement was a form that was requested by the members. A lot of times, either a brokerage is going to release a listing or even a property that's in escrow to another brokerage and maybe get a referral fee, or it might be an agent who leaves one company and goes to another. And in the process of leaving and going into another, the original broker may be assigning or transferring the listing to the new brokerage in exchange for either nothing or a referral fee or the seller paying something. So that's why this form was designed. And you can see it's a transfer of listing agreement. And if you look at the top part under paragraph 1, it says, principal and broker agree that by signing below, the listing shall be assigned to and transferred to a new broker, and any agency relationship with the broker and duties of broker arising out of the listing shall be terminated. The new broker shall be designated and serve as the seller's broker for the sale or lease of the property. Principal shall, there's a misprint there, which hopefully will be corrected before it comes out. It should say principal shall enter into a new listing agreement. It just says principal shall a new listing agreement. So hopefully they'll catch that. And then under consideration, you'll see that there's various choices there. In the process of transferring the listing to a new brokerage, the principal might agree with the broker to pay X amount of money for out-of-pocket expenses while the original broker had the listing, or it may be that the principal owes nothing, or it may be that the new broker agrees to pay you, the original broker, a referral fee of X for releasing the listing. So it's got the various options that everybody would agree to if the listing gets transferred. Paragraph 3 just talks about agency relationships, and it says principal acknowledges receipt of the agency. And then paragraph 4 talks about escrow, and it says that the property is already in escrow. The new broker agrees to execute and deliver a new cooperating broker compensation agreement and the escrow instructions to any cooperating broker. So that way we know that the new broker has agreed to pay the buyer's agent, just like the original broker had. Talks about MLS access and what the parties have to do with regard to the MLS. Paragraph 6, you can pretty much ignore. It talks about trust funds, but in this day and age, brokers don't have like deposits in trust fund accounts. Those are always in escrow. So you wouldn't really need to deal with a broker trust fund account. And then paragraph 7 says the listing agent, the listing was obtained through blank, the agent. Agent is no longer affiliated with the broker, or as of such and such a date won't be affiliated with, or the agent remains with the broker. Any potential situation could apply. And then it talks in paragraph 8 about the transaction files where the original broker would transfer over all the files to the new brokerage. And then paragraph 9 is a release that says that other than is provided herein, from this date forward, the broker and principal mutually release each other from any obligations under the listing and from all claims, actions, and demands that each may have against the other by reason of the listing. So there's a place for the principal to sign, the old brokerage and the new brokerage. So this is the form that you can use because this comes up fairly regularly when either an agent leaves and goes to another company and the original company is willing to release, the original brokerage is willing to release the listing, or just, for whatever reason, the agent doesn't leave, but you want out and the seller wants out and they want to list with the new brokerage and you're willing to do that and get a referral fee back, but you want to have a document that memorializes what's going on. So any questions on this form?
I don't
No?
see any, none.
Okay, good. I commend you on no questions. That either means you all understand it or that none of you are paying attention, one or the other. So I'll assume you all understand it. Moving along to the next form, this form is extremely confusing. This is the new fire hardening and defensible space advisory and disclosure. Now, this form was supposed to come out in June, but it came out early. It's already out. It's already in zip forms. And the reason it already came out is that the second part of this, the defensible space advisory, goes into effect July 1st. You've had the fire hardening form in place for several months now. That's been out for quite a while. But the defensible space goes into effect July 1st, 2021. And unfortunately, this form needs to be given to all buyers on properties that close escrow after July 1st, not open escrow. So you may have escrows that open right now. They're going to close after July 1st because it's already May 25th or whatever. And so you enter into an escrow now, it may very well close after July 1st. So you got to give this form if your escrow is going to close after July 1st. And that is why CAR rushed this form out so that you have it for your use. So I'm going to give you the fire hardening part of it, which has already been out, and we may have discussed it at a previous meeting that I was involved with. If the property is located, if it's 1 to 4 unit residential, and it's located in a high or very high fire hazard severity zone, and the seller is not exempt, an exempt seller, like the same exemptions that apply to TES, and if the property was built prior to 2010, so all three of those things has to be in a high or very high fire severity zone, not a exempt seller like an exemption under TDS, like a probate, an REO, successor trustee, and the property built prior to 2010, the seller needs to provide this form to the buyer. And if you're providing this form for the fire hardening part, then your seller would need to answer the questions in paragraph 3B, which is the fire hardening vulnerabilities. Now, none of that is new. That's all been out for about 6 months. How do you find out whether a property is in a high fire area? You go to the natural hazard disclosure form, which is why you want to get the natural hazard disclosure form up front at the time or before you take the listing. You need that. You do not want to wait until escrow closes to get the NHD form, because you need to get that up front. It needs to be delivered to the buyer up front because it is also a statutory form, and you need to find out from that form whether the property is located in a high or very high fire severity zone. Okay, so now we have this new defensible space aspect that goes into effect July 1st. It has the same exclusions. The property, in order to have to use this form, it has to be in a high or very high fire severity zone. If the seller is exempt because they're an exempt seller, they don't have to fill it out. But this particular law does not apply, does not exclude properties after 2010. So it's a little different than the fire hardening, which excludes properties built after 2010. This one does not. The second part of it, the defensible space, does not. So if the property is anytime the property is built, if the seller is not exempt, and if it's in a higher verified fire severity zone, this form has to be provided to buyers. So what is defensible space? Well, defensible space, if you look at paragraph 4, defensible space is basically the area within 100 feet of the property, and whether that property has had the brush cleared off, and whether there's anything in that area that potentially could cause a fire or whatever else. So this gets extremely confusing, but there's 4 options that can apply under the defensible space disclosure. The first option is that the property is subject to the state law now, right? The state law is what we're talking about, but there's no local ordinance. So you're in some area that has the state law, but they don't have any local ordinance separate from that with regard to defensible space. And there's lots of areas that don't have a separate local ordinance. They just have the state ordinance. So if you're in the state ordinance just says 2 things. Number 1, it says if the seller already got a report from CAL FIRE or from some entity that is authorized to give a report within the last 6 months before the sale, they need to give that form to the buyer. However, if the seller has not gotten that report, it's actually up to the buyer to provide a compliance and a report indicating that their property is in compliance with this defensible space within 1 year of the close of escrow. So it's not really a point of sale thing as far as the state's concerned. The only way it's a point of sale thing from the state's point of view is if the seller happens to already have a report because they did the work, they removed all the brush and they had somebody come out and do the report. If they have it, then you'd have to give it. But assuming the seller hasn't done that, they're not required to go out and do anything. They're simply, this form is simply to notify the buyer that they have 1 year to comply with the defensible space ordinance. So those are the first 2 options. Either the seller already has a report and he has to give it, or the buyer needs to do it with 1 year. Now, the 3rd and 4th options have to do with whether there is a local ordinance that deals with this. And some areas have a local ordinance, and don't ask me which areas because I have no idea right now because this is all new, but some areas have a local ordinance which kind of supersedes the state ordinance. So there may be a local ordinance that says, no, if we have a local ordinance here, you seller are required as a condition of closing escrow to provide the buyer with a form showing that you're in compliance with defensible space. Or some of the local ordinances kind of match the state ordinance and they just say that, if you seller have a report, you have to give it. If not, you have 1 year as the buyer to comply. So if you look down at paragraph 4A and B and then B1 and B2, B1 states that buyers shall obtain documentation of compliance with the defensible space law. And it says if there's no local ordinance, that basically the buyer will obtain it within 1 year of the close. And it also says under item 2 that if there is a local ordinance that requires proof of compliance with the defensible space, then the seller will either provide it if they have to according to the ordinance, or the buyer has 1 year. There's actually a second page to this form, item 3 and 4. So you got 4B, 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm not going to bother to put up the second page, but I'll just tell you what it says. So under item B, 1, 2, 3, and 4, it has the 4 options. Again, first option, no local, just state, and the seller already has a report, has to provide it to the buyer by close. Option 2, no local, only state, seller doesn't have a report, buyer has to do it within 1 year. Item 3, there is a local ordinance, and the local ordinance says the seller has to provide it by close. Item 4, there's a local ordinance, but it doesn't require the seller to do it by close. The buyer has a year or whatever the local ordinance says to comply. So that's the confusing form that we have. And again, because the law applies to any property closing after July 1st, you really need to start using this form now with your offers and counter offers and whatever. And the suggestion of CAR Legal, and Michael may have been, were you on the call Friday, Michael?
Yeah.
Yeah, so CAR Legal's opinion is that it may be a good idea, if the property is in a high or very high fire zone, it might be a good idea to either include this with a counteroffer, or if not, to make sure this gets to the buyer in the same time frame as the TDS, the natural hazard, and the agent's list visual inspection. So this form really needs to be done up front. So you have to start paying attention to this now.
Because this could give a buyer's right to rescind the contract.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So let's say you wait until June 20th to give this form, and then your escrow is not closing until after July 1st. This opens, anytime any one of these statutory forms is given to a buyer, it gives them a new 5-day rescission period. This is no different than the TDS or the natural hazard or whatever. So that's why it's so critical that this form be done upfront now if your escrow is going to close after July 1st. And you're not going to know for sure whether your escrow is, what if your escrow gets delayed? What if you have an escrow set to close June 20th and it gets delayed past July 1st? You know, it's a bad deal. I mean, once again, the legislature has done something to put us behind the 8 ball and put the sellers behind the 8 ball, because it's just very difficult to comply with it. But my advice and CAR Legal's advice is, if you're in a high or very high fire severity zone, start using the form now up front. Now, you should be able to find out whether a property is in a high or very high fire severity zone by looking at the NHD report, which is why you want to get it up front, because more and more of the NHD reports now are actually spelling out whether you need to supply the reports or not. Because they'll indicate, they'll have a checkbox saying whether it's in a high or very high fire severity zone, but in the body of the natural hazard report, it'll actually say, and the seller needs to provide the report if they're not exempt. Michael, you got a question?
I was gonna say, one of the questions in the chat room, if it's a condo in a building with more than 4 units, I'd say a condo is considered 1 unit. So,
Yeah, the condos aren't exempt from this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a good question, but condos aren't exempt because they're considered single. There's all kinds of issues with this. For instance, and I don't want to make it even more difficult than it is, but given that you have to provide a report, whether it's the buyer or seller, that there's a defensible space within 100 feet of your house in every direction, what if your neighbor is part of that 100 feet? I mean, your property's not going to have 100 feet all around it in 4 directions. More than likely, it's going to be involving some other neighbor. What happens then? Well, I don't know. I mean, that's going to have to be figured out. It's just one of these pieces of legislation that is going to be very difficult to comply with. But obviously, you can't force a neighbor to do anything if they're not going to do it. So I think, by the way, there's already a Q&A on this. If you go to car.org and you go to the Q&As, there's already a 4 or 5 page Q&A on the new defensible space disclosure form. So if you look at the top of the form, you'll see it says fire hardening and defensible space advisory and disclosure. So some brokerages are using this form all the time, whether a property is in a high or very high fire zone or not, just under the theory that it's only being an advisory, not a disclosure. So if you look at paragraph 2, where it says fire severity zone, paragraph 2 says A, the home is in a high or very high fire zone. That's when you would definitely have to use it. Or you have B that says the home is not in a high or very high fire hazard zone. Seller is providing this form as an advisory, and if paragraph 3B is completed below, as a voluntary disclosure. So theoretically, some brokerages may just be supplying this form even though property's not in a high zone, because maybe it's in an area that, you know, is close to some fires or whatever, and they just want to get the form out as an advisory. So it can actually be used either as an advisory if you check box 2B, or a disclosure when you actually have to make the disclosure. So with that, I'm going to go to any questions on this form.
There's nothing really in the chat. Robert Howell, if a local ordinance says seller has to comply, then seller has to clear before close of escrow.
Not only clear, but get a report from either CAL FIRE or the local fire department. We're not even sure yet who's the one that's going to be enforcing this or doing the work, but right now it looks like CAL FIRE or the local fire department is the one that's involved. By the way, CAR has said that within a short period of time, they're going to put out a list of all the local ordinances. You remember when they did, back when the eviction moratorium first came out, and some of you may have noticed that CIR put out all the local ordinances they knew about. So you go to this thing on CIR.org and it would say LA County, here's their ordinance. Santa Clarita, here, whatever. They're going to do the same thing with this. They're going to try to put out a comprehensive list of local ordinances that you can refer to see whether there's a local ordinance in addition to the statewide ordinance.
Okay, and we'll update the command checklist, which
Yep.
to include this.
Okay, can I move along then? We're good?
Yep.
Okay, we're going past this one. Now, those are the only new forms. Now I'm going to go to revised forms for June. The first one is the residential listing agreement that you're looking at. And I'm just going to go to the red stuff in here because all this other stuff's the same. If you look at page 2, you're going to see some.
Sorry, can I, while you're stop for a second, when you fill out your residential listing agreement, this comes up with you, and make sure you put in what you're offering to the cooperating broker.
Yes, back here, you see under item D, there's a blank to put in there. So if let's say you're taking listing at 6% and you're offering the other broker 3%, right? That's not going to be that big of a deal if you left it blank, because that's kind of what a seller would anticipate, but you're still supposed to fill it in there. Now, let's say you're taking 6% commission and you're taking 3.5 and offering the other broker 2.5. You absolutely positively need to disclose that to the seller, because that could impact, showings or whatever. And the seller has every right to know what portion you're getting and what portion the other broker's getting. So I would say that item D should always be filled in, but especially when you're taking a commission that's higher than what you're offering to the other brokerage.
I have a question.
George?
Yeah, are they coming soon still happening, or are they gonna get rid of it? It's just kind of like, right?
That's
right, you know.
coming soon is still around. They're not getting rid of it. It's constantly in a mode where it could change, but coming soon is still right now. All the different associations and MLSs have different coming soon rules, and they're still in place. So we go to this is the listing agreements being revised, and if you go to page 2, there is in fact some information on coming soon, and it just kind of indicates that there's each different MLS has slightly different rules on coming soon as to how you count days on market. So it's just kind of a statement here that the seller's advised to discuss with the broker how this days on market is going to be calculated if you put the property into coming soon category. The biggest change on this form is on this page here, which is page 3, and the red stuff you're looking at under item C. This has to do with the buyer love letters that I'm sure you've heard all kinds of discussion about, whether a seller should be looking at buyer letters and whether buyer letters are appropriate or not. So what we've done, what the Standard Forms Committee did, and I'm on the committee that did this, so I have some input as to what the thinking was, but this paragraph was put in there to have the seller and listing broker discuss this at the very beginning, not when an offer comes in, but at the listing point. At the time of the listing agent should have a discussion with the seller about these letters and get a statement from the seller whether they want to see them or they don't want to see them. Got somebody talking there, if you can mute them.
Sorry.
Quite all right. So if you look at paragraph C, C1 says, paragraph 8 of the Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory attached to this agreement. Let me get this out of the way a little bit if I can. I guess it won't go that way. Text description informs the seller of the practice of many buyers and their agents of including a buyer letter with an offer to try to influence a seller to accept the buyer's offer. Buyer letters may include photos and video. Whether overt or unintentional, buyer letters may contain information about a buyer or seller's protected class or characteristics. Deciding whether to accept an offer based upon protected classes or characteristics is unlawful. Broker will not review the content of buyer letters. And then you have 2 choices as seller. The default says, seller instructs broker not to present buyer letters, whether submitted with an offer or separately at a different time. Seller authorizes broker to specify in the MLS that buyer letters will not be presented to the seller. So that's the default. So if your seller says, you know what, I don't want to see these letters, you're done. You got the default there. If an offer comes in, you're not going to submit the love letter or the letter from the buyer to the seller. But paragraph B, 2B says, seller instructs broker to present the buyer letters. Broker advises seller that buyer letters may contain information about protected classes or characteristics, and such information should not be used in seller's decision of whether to accept, reject, or counter a buyer's offer. And if seller relies on buyer's letters, Seller is acting against the advice of broker and should seek the advice of their own counsel. So right then, at the time you take the listing, you have the seller and the listing agent having the discussion, the seller making the decision. And if the seller says, I don't want to see him, you could put in the agent's portion of the MLS a statement that the seller will not review or look at buyer letters that are attached to the offer. That's the main change, in my opinion, to this form. And I'm going to hold off if there's questions. Let me just finish the form. If you look at item E, there is now a statement that says that the broker is authorized to get a natural hazard disclosure report up front, and that the seller will pay for it because of the importance now of getting that NHD up front, so that, you know, for the defensible space and the for the fire hardening, et cetera, and because it's statutory. So there's also a bunch of other check boxes in case the seller authorizes the broker to get other reports like roof inspections or pool inspections or whatever. But the main one here is the natural hazard. And then if we go to the last page, under item 15, under key safe, there's a statement that if it's a tenant occupied property, the seller has to get the approval of the tenant in order to put a key safe on the property. You can't slap a key safe on the property with the seller's permission. If it's tenant occupied, you need the tenant's permission as well. So those are the changes in the the listing agreement. Are there any questions on that before I move on to the next form?
So I know in the broker call on Friday, it came up, well, what if an listing agent receives an offer with one PDF with a buyer letter? Do they now have a reason not to present it to the seller? What would be your thoughts?
Yeah, my thought is no, you have to present all offers to the seller. So one of the questions was, if I get an offer with a love letter and it's all attached, can I just send it back to the buyer's agent and say, I'm not going to present it until you get rid of the letter? And the answer to that is no. You need to present the offer. You need to delete the letter, the buyer letter, in whatever way you need to delete it. And in that conversation, there were 4 or 5 different ways that were available through zip forms to undo that letter from the rest of a PDF. So I'll leave that to you, Michael, to go over with your agents if they need some kind of technical information on how to do that. But there's a way of doing that. Any other questions on this one?
Yeah, Jeff, as far as the NHD report, is it now the default in the listing agreement that we're paying for it, that the seller's paying for it up front, did you say?
Well, no, there wouldn't be any, if you look at the language in the, let me go find it. It says investigations report. So seller agrees within 5 days of the beginning date of the agreement to order and, when required by the service provider, pay for a natural hazard. So it's an agreement between the listing agent and the seller to order it and pay for it.
But
Okay,
in a purchase agreement, the buyer could still offer to pay for it.
Theoretically, once the seller gets the report, I mean, theoretically, the seller could ask the buyer to reimburse him for the report or whatever. But since you already have the report, because the seller's getting it up front, normally the seller's going to pay for it. It's not that much money to worry about. And by the way, some of the natural hazard reports will issue reports up front without charging. They'll only charge when the escrow closes or whatever. So you'd have to check with your NHD company on that.
I'm not worried about the price. I'm just, this is now a change in that the default is we are now responsible for making sure that the seller gets it within 5 days of.
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
You want it up front, for sure. Yeah. Good point. I'm going to move along now to the lease listing agreement. The lease listing agreement is also being revised. If you go down to paragraph F, 3F, there's a change in how the commission is being paid to the cooperating broker, the tenant's broker. It was a little confusing before. It really wasn't worded properly. And now it just says that in the MLS, the commission to the buyers or the tenant's brokerage will be paid for a fixed term lease. It'll either be blank % of the total rent or blank dollars or whatever. So it's just kind of a clarification. The bigger change in this form is down on page, whatever page this is, 2, and also really page 3. Page 3 is the main change, but let's look at page 2. You may be aware of the fact that CAR has what's called an exempt seller disclosure form. It's a 1-page form that exempt sellers use when they're when they're like a probate or an REO. They don't have to use the TDS, but there's an exempt seller disclosure form. Well, in the past, That form was also used by landlords, or could be used by landlords to give to tenants. But there's like 10 or 12 questions in that form, and only 2 of them apply to landlord tenant. So CAR has revised that form, the exempt seller disclosure form, so it's only for buyers, sellers. It is not for landlord and tenant anymore. So they felt that they needed to cover those couple of items in the listing agreement and in the lease itself. And so now if you look down at that blue and red stuff, it has information about gas and electric meters, whether there's separate gas meters, separate electric meters, and whether there's been a death on the property, because that is still a requirement on a lease that you disclose to the tenant whether there's been a death on the property. Now, keep in mind, this is only the listing agreement, and this is just a disclosure at the beginning from the seller, whether there's been a death on the, or the landlord, whether there's been a death on the property. But that's going to need to be part of a disclosure made to a tenant when the lease is done. But then if you look at this next page, paragraph 14, this is really important, paragraph 14F. It says termination of agency relationship. So in the past, there's been times when, and you've probably, most of you who do leases have probably experienced this. So you do your lease, you're done. 6 months later, the tenant and the landlord get into an argument over something. Either the tenant defaults or there's an argument over God knows what. And they call you and they go, well, you're my broker. You need to step in and get this thing resolved. It's like, whoa, wait a second. I'm not a property manager here. I leased the property. When I leased the property and it was done, my agency was done. But it doesn't say that anywhere in the current lease agreement. So now we have termination of agency relationship in paragraph F, and it says, owner acknowledges and agrees that unless owner and broker enter into a separate property management agreement, the broker will not represent the owner in any manner regarding the management of the premises. Owner further agrees that the representation duties of an agency relationship with broker terminates at the earlier of 1 or 2 below, either the entering into a rental or lease agreement to the premises, and if checked, choose all that apply, either the tenant occupancy, delivering to tenant the keys, tenant walkthrough, completion of the move-in inspection, or, and then it says if no lease is already entered into, the expiration of this agreement. So what it's basically saying here is, wait a second, my agency ends at the point in time that the property is leased, or I give the keys to the tenant, or whatever's done at the very initial outset. I'm not your agent 6 months later when there's a problem. That's between you, the landlord, and the tenant. Don't be calling me to have me resolve the problem. That's not my duty. Okay, so that's the main change in this form. Questions on that?
Good.
No? Okay, I'm going to move along to cooperating broker compensation agreement, which you see is almost entirely in red, right? But it's not entirely in red because it's all new. It's just been revised and reshaped. So that's why everything's in a different area to make it easier to use. But the one major change here, which for some reason wasn't in the previous form, is if the buyer's agent is going to take less, they agree to take less than what was in the MLS, we don't want just the buyer's agent to sign it. We need the buyer's manager or broker to sign. So that has been added in the bottom of the form. Now you have a place for the listing agent's broker or manager to sign and the buyer's agent's broker to sign if the commission is being reduced. If the commission is not being reduced, the buyer's agent manager doesn't have to sign. But if they're going to agree to reduction in the commission, then there's not a place for the buyer's manager to sign.
Can I make another suggestion why you would use this form?
sorry.
Somebody mute themselves. That's, anyway, if you're a member, if you're offering a property on for a property that's in a different MLS and we're a member of, you'd want to use this.
Well, you'd use this form. This form would be used, the form itself would be used if the commission is changing in the MLS, or if you're a member, if you're in an MLS that doesn't share data with your MLS. So let's say you made an offer on a property in San Francisco. Their offer of compensation is just to their members or surrounding data share partners. And right now you're not a data share partner with San Francisco, so you would need this form. But you don't really need, if you're like in West LA and you make an offer on a property in the Valley, you don't really need this form because they're data share partners already. And any thing that's put into CRMLS or CLAW would be a cooperating broker with anybody in the San Fernando Valley. So it doesn't hurt to use this, but you wouldn't need to as long as it's a data share partner. Got it?
Got it.
Okay, moving along to the next form, referral fee agreement. So this form, the only thing that was changed here is there was some concern in the old version. What happens if you say you're going to pay me a referral fee if the buyer buys within 12 months? Does that mean that the buyer has to close escrow within 12 months? Or does that mean the buyer has to enter into an escrow within 12 months and close whenever? And so it was changed. If you look at the red language there, it says enter into contract. So if you're going to pay a referral fee to another broker and you say you'll pay up for within 12 months or 6 months or whatever, it's not the closing date that matters. It's the date it goes into escrow. It's just like a listing agreement. If you have a listing agreement and the property sells during the listing, but it closes after the listing runs out, you still get paid. Well, this is the same thing. If you have a referral and it enters into escrow, that principal, you get paid regardless of when it closes, as long as the referral entered into contract during the term of the referral fee. Questions on that? Okay, the next one is the property images agreement. The only change here is there was paragraph 7 was added for drone use because more people now are using drones to take pictures. There's a paragraph that talks about drones and an indemnification paragraph with regard to drones, so you can check that out at your convenience. And then the statewide buyer and seller advisory, there's been some changes to this form. This is a long form. I don't know if it's 16 pages now or whatever, but one of the changes they made is on page 2. You'll see there's a table of contents, and it used to have just this stuff, you know, the different sections. It's so long now that there's actually a table of contents, an alphabetical table of contents telling you where to find stuff. So if you're looking for home warranty information, you go down alphabetically and you see, oh, it's on page 26. So it's to make it easier for you to use, you know, the form. And within the form, there are some changes. There's the fire hardening and wildfire disaster has been added in here to provide some additional information there. There's a paragraph on wildlife saying that California is the home for many species of wildlife. There's also for coastal areas, a sea level rise coastal properties. Doesn't apply to all the properties, but a lot of the coastal areas wanted this language added into this addendum. So those are the basic changes to the form. Any questions on this one, on the statewide buyer and seller? Okay, if not, I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to go out of this. You can see my cat for a minute. And then I'm going to go to this form, I believe. Yeah. So don't worry about my cat staring at you. He's friendly. She's friendly. So now I'm going to go over to, and hopefully quickly, relatively quickly, go over the new coronavirus forms. So you probably all know that about 2 weeks ago, or maybe a week ago, actually, CAR put out a whole bunch of new forms to revise the PED, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a new PED all form that you're looking at right now, PED all. This PED all form replaces the old PED V, PED S, and all the other PED forms. And now you have just one page form that's a PED all form that you can use to have your buyers or tenants or whoever sign. And you don't need to sign this every time you go into a property or for every different property. You just need to sign this once, whoever's entering the property. And then this form is good as long as their physical condition doesn't change. Obviously, if their physical condition changes and they come down with COVID or whatever, you would need to redo it. But otherwise, you don't need to keep redoing the PED form. You can just use this one form now. Also, attached to it is the new guidelines, the broker guidelines and the guidelines from the government. And it's now a one-page form here that attaches to the PED all form. Now, if you're holding an open house, which you can now do, you don't even need a PED all form at all. If you want to, you could use the PED form for everybody entering, but if you want to, you can use this new open house and showing guidelines sign-in form. It's a PSI form, and you can see that you could use this. So when people are coming to the property, at the top, it says what the people agree to. They agree to practice, you know, all the things they're supposed to do, social distancing, wearing masks, et cetera, et cetera. And then they can sign in either electronically or sign in by paper. And then you don't need a PED form. You can actually just use this form for them entering into an open house. And I'm just going to go, I'll get to some questions in a minute, but let me just go through the rest of the forms. There's a new form for posting on the door. It's pretty similar to the old form, but it has a few changes in there, and you still have to post on the doors this form on all the properties before showings. And then there's now a new, to make matters a little more confusing, there's a new listing agreement open house addendum, which is called the LOHA form. You don't need this form unless you use the previous coronavirus addendum to the listing agreement, because the previous coronavirus addendum to listing agreement said there won't be any open houses. The seller won't allow any open houses. So if you used that form previously, and so you have something saying no open houses, you have to have your seller agree to hold open houses if they want to, and you could use this form. And if you look at right above paragraph 1, it says this is an amendment to the already existing listing agreement. That's really the only time you're going to need it, as an amendment to an already existing listing agreement where you have a statement that they don't allow open houses, and then give them the option to allow open houses. And then finally, there's the listing agreement coronavirus, the old RLA CAA, which has been revised, and the revision includes allowing open houses as opposed to the old form, which didn't allow open houses. So actually, you could use either one of these. You really don't need both. That's pretty much the new guidance. You probably all have heard that you're allowed to do open houses now, but you still have to. One of the questions is, can we do open houses as we normally did in the past? Not exactly. You can't let people wander through the open houses unattended, not practicing social distancing and not wearing masks. They have to wear masks. They have to social distance. They have to clean their hands as they go in. You're supposed to make sure that they don't touch a bunch of countertops and things. You should air out the place by having doors and windows open if possible. You can allow more than one group in at a time. My personal preference is that you probably limit it to 1 or 2 unrelated groups at a time, not have 4 or 5 or 6 different buyer groups going through, for 2 reasons. Number 1, they're not going to social distance. They're going to be bumping into each other. And number 2, it was never a good idea, even before COVID, to have people wandering through the house unattended for purposes of people stealing things or thinking things getting broken. It's just, you should have some control over your open house regardless of COVID. And I would never think that it would be a good idea to have more than 1 or 2 groups in at a time. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions on that.
Kathy is asking in the chat, she wants to know if the PSI is going to replace the other coronavirus advisories. It can, or you could use them both. So.
Yeah, the PSI is not replacing the other advisories. The PSI form is basically a form you can use at open houses for people to sign in.
Can you, because I was at open houses this past weekend, it seems like it would be practically better if we could do this like on an iPad or something. So
Yeah.
can we create this in an iPad form?
Yes, yeah, you could do it electronically.
Yeah.
So,
And by the way, you could still use a PED. You could still use the PED all if you don't want to use this. You can use a PED all or this. You don't need to use both for open houses, and you can do it electronically.
so not about the open houses, but if we have individual showing, like by appointments, I'm just wondering if we can use this form as as the people are coming in for the showing, we could just use this PSI form to have them sign it. So it's kind of like having everybody on the same form instead of individual PED forms.
You could, although this form was really designed for open houses, so I probably would still recommend on individual showings using the PED all form, because it's only a 1-page form too.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure.
Are we getting into door knocking, flyers and gifts?
I'll be happy to. So for CAR's legal's opinion now is that door knocking should still not be done, but that door dropping can be done. So in other words, you can have somebody go around and drop flyers on the doorstep, but you really shouldn't be door knocking yet for a couple of reasons. Number one, there's no guidance that says that you absolutely can't do it. But as a practical matter, people just don't want anybody knocking on their door in this time. It's just, what's going to happen is Michael's going to get 15 complaint calls from people saying, how dare your agents knock on our door during COVID, blah, blah. Just don't do it. But if you want to drop stuff off, that's fine.
So from assuming our agents don't do that, but let's say, what if somebody wants and does do that? Are there, what are the ramifications? Is it a DRE thing? Is it a Department of Health?
You mean if you knock on the door?
Yeah,
Nothing is really going to happen unless the owner complains. If the owner complains, they could file something with the DRE or the Public Health Department. And then who knows? I mean, depending on, things are changing fairly regularly here. And we've moved in LA, we've moved to, I think, the yellow tier now. And if it moves to the next tier, then things are going to open up more. So I don't know that there's a whole lot of downside, other than there may be downside. People complain about a lot of things that they don't need to complain about. So it doesn't do you any good from a public point of view in dealing with the public to have them complaining about you doing things they don't like. So there may not be a whole lot of legal ramification, but there just may be, it may just give you kind of a black eye in the public perception that you're doing things that they don't like you doing.
Got it.
Okay, anything else with regard to that? If not, I've got a.
Jeff, can I go back to the open houses?
Sure.
As far as mask wearing, so the document, the PDAL says that everybody has to wear a mask.
Yeah.
However, everything on the news and whatnot is, hey, Los Angeles is opening up and you don't have to wear a mask outside. So what's the fix for when people show up at your open house and say, I'm vaccinated, I'm not wearing a mask, screw you, I'm coming in, that type of thing?
Well, the requirements, the requirements for open houses still require mask wearing. So if they say, screw you, I don't want to wear a mask, then you have to make a decision at that point, or the seller has to make a decision. Are you gonna let them in? Or are you going to say, sorry, if you don't wear a mask, you can't come in? And you're potentially going to get that because people get all upset about things and they, but basically, if you look at the guidelines, the guidelines for open houses are not the same as the tier requirements, that are put out by the LA County or LA City or the local ordinances. So right now they're still required. Now that could change. They could change in 2 weeks where they say you don't have to wear a mask anymore. But right now you're supposed to wear a mask. The other thing is you're not supposed to serve any food indoors at an open house. Any food you're serving is supposed to be outdoors. So that's a good question, but you're going to run into that. You just kind of have to deal with it on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
Okay, if there's no other questions, I got a few minutes left, and there were a couple other topics I wanted just to touch upon if I could. Michael, any other questions?
Well, hopefully one of those topics is the new purchase agreement that's coming out and what should we be looking to in the future.
Okay, well, it wasn't, but it will be now. So again, I'm on that committee that's revising the form. It's not done yet. It will be out in December. It won't be out until second week of December. We're still working. It was supposed to be done at the end of May. It's not done because we got a bunch more. I think we got 600 more comments. There was a meeting a couple weeks ago where anybody could sign on to the webinar and get it, kind of a look at the form. There were 3,000 people on the call. And from that, we got 600 more comments. So we're still going through. I've got a meeting every Thursday for the next 4 weeks, including the last 2 Thursdays, to go through all the comments. So the form will be done by within the next couple of weeks, but the training won't start because it takes a lot of time to get it up and running and get all the forms on zip forms. I mean, there won't be any classes until August, and there won't be any, the form won't be out until December. So until December, you'll still be using the old form. If you want to see what the form looks like right now, you can go to car.org, you click on the top, you go to standard forms, I believe, and if you click on that, you will see the newest revision, but it's not the final revision of the purchase agreement. I will tell you that it won't change the way you do business at all. In other words, contingency removal is the same. The notice to buyer perform is the same. The way you do business is pretty much the same, but it is laid out completely differently than the old form. It is, you will look at it and go, you won't recognize it. It's totally different. And what the committee has done is they've taken all the stuff that needs to be filled in, timeframes for things, inspections, and it's all on a grid on the first 3 pages of the form. So you don't have to look through page 9 and 12 and 13 to find what time frame for the physical inspection, the loan, the appraisal, etc. Everything's in a grid on the first 3 pages. So that's a good thing, I think. One of the complaints about it is that because all the stuff's on the first 3 pages, that the clients won't read page 4 through 16. But the response to that is, how many of your clients are now reading the entire contract as it is? How many of your buyers and sellers read the entire 10, 12-page contract now? And in 3 different places on the new form, we have a statement saying this form is 16 pages long and you should be reading all 16 pages of the form. It's stated 3 times. It's stated at the beginning, it's stated above the buyer's signature, it's stated above the seller's signature. So what happens is you've got this grid that has all the timeframes in it, and then each paragraph in the grid refers you to another paragraph in the contract, which goes into more detail, for instance, about the inspection contingency or the loan contingency or the appraisal contingency, et cetera, et cetera. Also built into the form now is the representative capacity form. You won't need a separate representative capacity form anymore because it's built into the purchase agreement. So it's going to require, no doubt, a thorough training of the agents. As the time gets closer, I'm sure that I'll be doing training sessions. I'm doing training sessions at the Southland Regional. I've got a couple of dates in August, but I'm sure I'll have to do training for the various KW offices. It's going to be a long training session. I mean, the purchase contract class is probably going to be a 4-hour class. So maybe, Michael, maybe you could talk to the powers that be to see if we could figure out a way of getting a training session for Keller Williams, which involves all the different, maybe Paul Morris offices or whatever, and do it a couple of times. Because the thought of doing this like 10 different times for 10 different offices makes me kind of nauseous. Because it's just a long form and I just don't want to teach it 20 times. So maybe you can start the ball rolling and see, because there's plenty of time to arrange this, to see if we're able to arrange something that I can do for your group, your KW group, which combines a whole bunch of the offices into one.
All right. And yeah, as I said earlier, when we were notified about it, it's a good idea to look at it so you're familiar with it.
Yeah.
It's substantively the same, but just it's laid out different.
Right. And we're at 3 o'clock, but I'm just going to refer you to, I'm going to go to the bottom here and just show you a couple of quick guides. There's a quick guide. In order to find the quick guides, you just go to CIR.org. In the top right, there's a thing that says search. Just type in quick guide and all the quick guide ties up. And there's a lot of really good quick guides. There's all kinds of questions about escalation clause. We don't have time today to cover that, but here's a great quick guide that tells you what the advantages and disadvantages of escalation clauses are. There's another quick guide that talks about the appraisal contingency, because agents write those wrong all the time. When when the buyers say they'll pay like 10,000 above the appraised value, and then the appraised value comes in low, and the buyer says, okay, I'll pay 10,000 above the appraised value, seller, now you got to sell it to me for that price. And the seller says, I never agreed to sell it to you for 10,000 above the appraised value. You just said you'd pay that. I never agreed that I would do it. So there's language in here that covers those various scenarios. And then
Can I, on the appraisal contingency, this was a question someone asked me earlier this morning. Can I, we're waiving appraisal contingencies on offers now to make them competitive, but I still have the loan contingency. I could still use, my buyers could still use that to get out.
Nope. Well, yes and no. If you waive the appraisal contingency, you can't use the loan contingency to get out because of the appraisal. So if you waive the appraisal contingency, and then the only reason you can't get the loan is because the appraisal comes in low, you got a problem. Now, if you can get out because of the loan contingency because you don't qualify, or because your credit score is not good, or the buyer himself doesn't qualify, that's fine. But the language in the contract specifically says that once the appraisal contingency is removed, now your appraisal is going to come in low. The lender's going to say the appraisal came in low, so I can't lend to you, so you don't get your loan. And you're going to try to get out on the loan contingency, and it's not going to work. Assuming the listing agent and the seller are awake, it's not going to work because you've removed the appraisal contingency, and the language specifically says you can't do that. So the moral of the story is don't remove the appraisal contingency until you have to.
Unfortunately, that's not happening now because every counteroffer is coming back without it.
It's a mistake. And if you look at this, if you look at the appraisal thing, I think it covers that as well. But if you look at the purchase contract and the paragraph that covers the appraisal contingency and the loan contingency, it says in both places in black and white that once you remove the appraisal contingency, if the reason you can't get the loan is because the appraisal comes in low, tough luck. Doesn't use the word tough luck, but that's what it says. So that's a problem. And the last one I wanted to mention was, because I know this is happening, in order to get your deal through, you're writing non-contingent offers. And your offer has no contingencies. Two points. Number one, the statutory disclosures, the TDS, the home hardening thing now if it applies, the agents, the listing agents, Avid, those are statutory. A no contingent offer has nothing to do with the statutory 5-day rescission period. So even if you have a no contingent offer, if those documents are delivered after the offer is written, the buyer still has 5 days to cancel. If all those things were done before an offer was written and you had a non-contingent offer, then technically, if they get all the statutory closures before the offer is written, there is no 5-day rescission period. Also, the risk factor in making a non-contingent offer, especially on investigation and inspection of the property, is pretty huge. So I know that buyers are doing that because they want to get the property, but the risk factor is not only on the buyer, but the risk factor is on the brokers and the seller. And what I mean by that is you write an offer non-contingent on the inspection, the offer gets accepted. Later on, the buyer finds out there's a problem, either because they do an inspection, even though it's not a contingency, or after the close of escrow, they find some problem. And they're not going to blame themselves because they waived the contingency. Who are they going to blame? Everybody else. And now it's going to be your fault and the buyer's agent's fault and the seller's fault for not allowing them the time to do an inspection. So I know this sounds contrary to what you would think, but most attorneys are recommending that even if an offer comes in non-contingent, all contingencies, that the seller put back into the offer an inspection or investigation contingency for like 5 days or whatever. I'm not so worried about the loan and the appraisal contingency. If the buyer wants to write an offer without that, they just better understand what the circumstances are. But when you're talking about the inspection and the investigation, there's no way for a buyer to know up front what that property problems are. And the seller, there may be things that would be discovered in an inspection that the seller doesn't even know about, foundation problems, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very, very risky from a risk management position for a seller and a listing broker and a buyer to go with a non-contingent offer that's not contingent on any inspections. Just we've had one after the other that's problematical. So
Jeff, I have a quick question about that.
go ahead.
May I?
Yeah, go ahead.
So if we have a new finding during an inspection that nobody knows about it, even the seller didn't know about it, doesn't that kind of, does not allow us?
No, the reason that does, it's a good question, but the reason it doesn't, so the law says that the seller, if they become aware of, some subsequent disclosure, they did their TDS and now there's a subsequent disclosure. So the seller finds out, let's say 2 weeks into the escrow, there's a fire in the house. And now the seller has to make a further disclosure. That gives a 5-day rescission period. But it also says in that language that anything discovered by the buyer in their own investigations isn't something the seller now has to disclose. So that doesn't start over a new 5-day rescission period because the seller's not making the disclosure. The buyer found it out on their own. And if the buyer found it out on their own and they didn't have an investigation contingency in place, they don't have a contingency to get out. So it's a great question, but it's only when the seller has to make a subsequent disclosure of something that the buyer is not already aware of. So again, the fire is a perfect example, or a roof leak. But if the buyer has no contingencies and they decide to do an inspection and the inspection just points out all this stuff, they
Got
didn't
it.
have any contingency.
Got it.
Good question. Okay, anything else?
Looking.
You got to pay me overtime already.
Well, you didn't realize our 2 to 3 meetings really go 2 to 3:30 anyway.
I kind of figured that.
I mean, does anyone have any questions? Speak now or
Forever.
call me later.
Yeah.
Call me later.
One more, and you may have said it already and I didn't hear. When is the new purchase agreement in effect?
It won't be out until the second or third week of December.
Oh, okay.
Plenty of time to do nothing about it and then panic at the last minute.
You say that now, but it's already
But
June.
the training will be starting in August.
So Josh, could you maybe speak, Josh,
Yeah, I'm here.
can you maybe speak and, with the other forward living offices
Yeah.
and see? if-
Oh, I'd love that. That'd be great. And we could do more than one class, and maybe we can record it too, so that the people that aren't on the call will be able to access it. But I hope you can understand that teaching this a 4-hour class 10 or 12 times is not something I would look forward to.
Yep.
So I have a quick question. So all of
Alex,
these,
remind me to talk to Jen. Please.
all of these forms are available now. We have to use them. We have to, the lease listing agreement, all that. We need to use the updated one, the 621.
Yeah, but they don't come out until the second week of June, so they'll be out in a couple weeks.
Deborah Moore has a question.
When the new forms come out, it deletes the old version. So if you're using zip forms, you won't be able to use the old version. It'll be gone.
So we have to What about if we just signing up a lease listing agreement or listing agreement?
You just use the current forms for listing
Mhm.
agreement, and you use the current forms that are in zip forms now, if you're doing a current agreement, but within 2 weeks, the new forms will be out.
Yeah.
But if you're talking about the PED forms, you don't have to worry about that because the new listing agreement will allow open houses. You wouldn't need those other forms.
Thank you. Deborah?
I just have questions about, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, I have a lot of questions about that one complicated form. Michael, will you know more of it if we have questions about what Jeff went over about the fire and what's that thing called, fire and defensible form?
Defensible space.
Yeah, I'm not going to know more than Jeff Kahn.
Oh my God.
So
what-
rather than all of you contacting me about that, contact Michael. Let Michael maybe put a list together of whatever questions in there, and then I'll answer them all at one time. But
Oh, that was
but
good.
there is, but there is before
Report,
you,
you kept saying they can get a report up front. What report? Do you mean the NHD report?
no, it would be a report from the either CAL FIRE or the fire department indicating the property is clear. But there is
How did they get that report? How do they get that report? How does an owner get that report?
you have to contact either CAL FIRE or the local police, the local fire department.
Oh my
Do you
God.
recommend
So there is a
the
wait,
seller?
hold on 1 second.
Robert, 1 second.
Hold on 1 second. There's a Q&A on this that's in CAR. Before you start peppering Michael with questions, please go to car.org and read the Q&A. It's a 4-page or so Q&A on this, and it covers a lot of the questions that you probably have. So please do that first before you start, winding up questions. So what was the other question?
I was just asking, do you recommend calling the fire department ahead of time?
Yeah, that's how the
listing?
form, Michael, that's how the form
Or
reads, to
just-
me, by the way. Just how you said it. We couldn't hear a word you said. We couldn't understand a word you said. It was all muffled. And that's how the form looks to me and to agents. But does anybody know what that question was?
Robert, can you say it again? You were
He
slow.
was asking if it
Oh.
makes sense. I speak Robert E. Howell. He was asking if it makes sense to call the fire department, I think, in advance of opening or when you get the listing to see if they've, if they're.
It's funny, but I was on a call Friday, and one of the agents in Acton had called the fire department in Acton, and she said they had no clue about this at all. They were completely.
Figures.
So, but still, it has until July 1st to kick in, I suppose, but still, you got deals now that aren't going to close until after July 1st. So you may have to use the form, but then you'll have until July 1st for the seller to figure out or for the buyer to figure out what needs to be done. And by then, hopefully, the local fire departments and CAL FIRE will have more information on that.
I'm trying to find the defensible, that Q&A.
If you want, I have it in front of me, and if you want, I will PDF it to you after the meeting, and then you could put it out to your agents.
Yeah.
Yep.
that's
Right.
good.
I made it wasn't 4 pages. It's
Just tell me the title. I'll search for it now.
It's called Defensible Space Law. Defensible Space Law. And if you're in car.org in the top right, just type in Defensible Space Law,
Yeah, I got it.
and it should pop up. You got it?
Yep.
And so you don't need me to email it to you?
Well, I still email it, but
Thank you, Jeff.
well,
You're welcome, Howie.
Yeah. Thanks, Michael.
all right.
Thank
guys.
you.
Okay, you're welcome. Everybody good?
Yep. I'm sure I'll speak to you like in an hour and an
Yeah, right.
hour after that.
Okay,
Thank you.
All right.
take care. Everybody have a good day. Keep out of trouble.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.